Imagine standing in the middle of a great American city in the year 1876. The sun went down hours ago. And yet the streets are not dark. Light pours from the windows of buildings that stretch impossibly high for their era, buildings wrapped in cast iron, copper, and ornament that no modern developer would ever pay for today. There are no smokestacks belching coal smoke over these particular districts. There is no power station humming on the edge of town. And still, somehow, the city glows. That image sits at the center of one of the strangest theories in alternative history. The claim is simple and almost impossible to believe. Long before Thomas Edison flipped the switch on his first power station, certain American cities were already running on electricity. Not coal, not gas, something its believers call free atmospheric electricity. Energy pulled straight out of the air and the ground, costing nothing, metered by no one, owned by no one, and then, according to the theory, I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Within a single generation, it was gone, replaced, rebuilt, quietly written out of the record by the year 1900. Tonight we are going to walk through that claim from the very beginning, where it came from, what its believers point to, and the part almost nobody wants to talk about, the money. Because if any of this were true, the most important question would not be how the lights worked, it would be who profited from switching them off. Let's get into it. To understand why this theory exists at all, you first have to understand the story we were all taught, the official one, the one in every textbook. For most of human history, when the sun went down, the world went dark. People burned candles, whale oil, tallow. Then came gas. By the middle of the 1800s, the wealthier streets of London, Paris, and New York were lit by gas lamps, fed through a network of pipes from a central gasworks. A man with a long pole walked the streets at dusk, lighting each lamp by hand. It was smoky, it was dangerous, and it was expensive, but it was progress. Then, on the 4th of September, 1882, the story reaches its hero. Thomas Edison powered up the Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan, a coal-fired generating plant feeding direct current electricity to a few dozen buildings in a single square mile. The official record calls this the birth of the modern electrical age. From that one building, the lights spread. City by city, decade by decade, the grid grew until it covered the entire country. Clean, simple, linear. One inventor, one switch, one moment when the lights came on. But here is where the people who study this start asking uncomfortable questions. Because if electric lighting truly began in 1882, then why do we have written accounts, photographs, and city records describing buildings that were already wired, already glowing, already humming with power years and in some cases decades earlier? Why do so many structures built in the 1860s and 1870s look, to these researchers, like they were designed around technology that supposedly did not exist yet? That is the door this whole theory walks through. And once you walk through it, the questions only get stranger. Start with the buildings themselves. Anyone who has stood in front of a great 19th century American structure has felt it. The courthouses, the train stations, the exposition halls, the old hotels, the sheer scale of them, the domes, the spires, the towers that seem to serve no structural purpose, the copper cladding, the wrought iron that curls like it was grown rather than forged. We are told these were built by hand, by laborers earning a few dollars a week, using horses, pulleys, and raw muscle, often in just a year or two. Proponents of the atmospheric theory look at these buildings and they do not see decoration. They see machinery. They argue that the towers were not vanity. They were antennas. The domes were not for grandeur. They were resonators, shaped to collect and concentrate something in the air. The copper and iron were not chosen because they looked rich. They were chosen because they conduct. To a believer, a 19th century city hall is not a building with a fancy tower on top. It is a power receiver with offices built around it. And then there is the strangest exhibit of all, the White Cities. In 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition. For one summer, a section of the city was transformed into something that genuinely looked like it came from another world. Gleaming white palaces, grand canals, classical columns and statues stretching as far as the eye could see. Contemporary visitors described walking through it and weeping, convinced they were seeing the future. At night, the whole complex blazed with what was reported to be hundreds of thousands of electric lights, a display so overwhelming that people who had never seen a single light bulb suddenly stood beneath an ocean of them. The official story is that this white city was built deliberately, as a temporary fantasy. The grand buildings were not stone at all. They were wood and steel frames covered in a plaster mixture, painted white, meant to last a single season and then be torn down. And torn down they were. Within a few years, almost the entire thing was gone, much of it consumed by fire. But the believers asked the obvious question: why would anyone build something that beautiful, that advanced, that staggering in scale, only to destroy it on purpose? And they ask a second question that is harder to wave away. If the technology to light a small city already existed in 1893, fully formed, fully wired, glowing across acres of buildings, then why are we told that the electrical age had barely begun a decade earlier? How do you go from one experimental power station in 1882 to an entire luminous city in 1893, and then call the second thing temporary and forgettable? To them, the world's fairs were not exhibitions of the future. They were the last public appearance of a world that was already being dismantled. There is another detail believers point to, and once it is pointed out, it is hard to unsee. Across older American and European cities, you can find buildings whose ground floor windows sit half buried below the level of the modern sidewalk, doorways that now lead nowhere. Entire arched openings sunk beneath the street, sometimes a full story down. The official explanation is again straightforward. Cities raised their street levels over time to install sewers, to fight flooding, to bury the chaos of pipes and wires beneath the road. Chicago famously jacked entire buildings up out of the mud in the 1850s and 1860s. This is documented and it is real, but the atmospheric theory reads those buried floors as a clue. They argue that the older structures were not built sunken. They were buried, swept under by some great resurfacing event that the official record smooths over as routine engineering. To a believer, a first floor under the sidewalk is not a sewer project. It is the burial line of an older city, an earlier layer, the world that came before the reset. Whether that is profound or simply a misread of ordinary municipal history is, like everything else in this story, left for you to decide. Now, before this goes any further, we have to talk about the part of the theory that actually has roots in real science, because atmospheric electricity is not made up. It is real. For centuries, scientists knew the sky carried a charge. Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment in 1752 was about exactly this, drawing electrical energy out of a storm. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, researchers across Europe and America studied what they called atmospheric electricity, the natural voltage that exists between the ground and the upper air. It is a genuine physical phenomenon. Even today, the difference in electrical potential between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere is measured in hundreds of thousands of volts. The dream, for the more ambitious minds of the era, was obvious. If that energy is just sitting there, all around us, all the time, then why are we burning coal and gas? Why not simply reach up and take it? And this is where one name towers over everything: Nikola Tesla. Tesla was not a fringe figure. He was one of the most important inventors who ever lived, the man whose alternating current system actually became the backbone of the real electrical grid we use today. But Tesla had a second dream, one that the official record treats as a noble failure. He believed he could transmit electrical power through the earth and the air, without wires, to anyone, anywhere, for free. In 1901, with funding from the financier J.P. Morgan, Tesla began building a structure on Long Island called Wardenclyffe. At its heart stood an enormous tower, nearly 190 feet tall, topped with a great dome of metal. Tesla's stated goal was wireless communication. But in his own writings and letters, he made it clear he was reaching for something bigger, the wireless transmission of power itself, a world where energy was as free and as available as the air you breathe. And then, abruptly, the money stopped. Morgan withdrew his funding. The project collapsed. The tower stood unused for years and was eventually demolished for scrap during the First World War. Tesla died alone and in debt in a New York hotel room in 1943. The official explanation is that the idea simply did not work, and that Morgan, a businessman, stopped paying for a project with no path to profit. The believers point to one line that Morgan is often quoted as having understood instantly. If energy is free and wireless, where do you put the meter? You cannot sell something you cannot measure. You cannot bill a customer for the air. There is a deeper layer here that the theory loves to dwell on. Tesla held hundreds of patents, and many of his most ambitious ideas about energy transmission were either never built, never funded, or quietly shelved. The official story says this is simply what happens to ideas that are ahead of their time and short on money. The believers say it is what happens to ideas that threaten the people who already own the existing system. In their telling, the suppression of free energy was not a single dramatic act. It was a slow strangling. Pull the funding here. Deny the patent there. Let the inventor die broke, and let his most dangerous work gather dust in a filing cabinet until everyone who understood it is gone. You do not need to burn a library if you simply make sure no one is ever paid to read it. To the atmospheric theory, Wardenclyffe is not a story about a dream that failed. It is a story about a dream that was deliberately switched off, and they argue Tesla was not inventing something new. He was trying to publicly rebuild something that older builders already knew, something that was already quietly powering cities a generation before, and something that powerful men had every reason to bury. So what, exactly, do the believers claim was actually happening in those pre-1880 cities? Here is the theory in full. They argue that the ornate architecture of the 19th century was a functioning energy system hidden in plain sight. The tall iron and copper spires acted as collectors, pulling charge from the atmosphere the way a lightning rod pulls a strike, but continuously and gently. The domes concentrated and stored it. The buildings, riddled with metal frames and copper conduits, distributed it. And the foundations, often sunk deep into the earth and surrounded by specific minerals, completed the circuit by drawing on ground current as well. They point to the so-called star forts. These are real structures, found all over the world, built in the shape of perfect, geometric, multi-pointed stars. The official explanation is straightforward. They were a military design, the shape engineered to deflect cannon fire and eliminate blind spots for defenders. But believers look at that same precise geometry and see something else, an antenna, a resonant shape tuned to gather energy from the land and sky. To them, the star fort is not a defensive wall. It is the battery at the heart of the old system. In this version of history, a pre-1880 city did not need a coal plant on its outskirts, because the city was the power plant. Every building participated. The energy was ambient, distributed, and according to the theory, effectively free. No bill arrived at the end of the month, because there was no central company to send one. The power belonged to the place, not to a corporation. It is a genuinely beautiful idea. A world where the lights cost nothing, and the architecture itself did the work. And whether or not you believe a single word of it, you have to admit it explains, at least emotionally, why those old buildings still make us feel something that glass and steel towers never do. They feel alive. But a beautiful theory is not a true one. And the strongest part of this entire story is not the architecture, and it is not Tesla. It is the part that almost nobody who tells this story bothers to follow. The economics. So let's follow it. Forget, for a moment, whether free atmospheric power ever existed. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Ask a colder question instead. If you were a businessman in the late 1800s and a free, ungoverned, unmeterable energy source existed, what would you do about it? You would destroy it, not out of malice, out of arithmetic. A man cannot build a fortune selling something that falls freely from the sky. There is no profit in air. The entire logic of an industrial economy depends on scarcity. You find something people need, you control the supply of it, and you charge them for access. Water, you can bottle. Land, you can fence. Coal, you can dig and own. But ambient electricity that hums through every building for free is, to an investor, the single most dangerous thing imaginable. It is a product that cannot be owned. Now look at what actually got built between roughly 1880 and 1910, and look at who built it. Centralized power stations, coal furnaces, a spiderweb of copper wires running from one company-owned plant out to every home and business, and on every one of those homes, a small device, the meter. A machine whose only job is to measure exactly how much you used, so that exactly the right bill can be sent. The official history calls this progress. The atmospheric theory calls it a business model defeating a better technology. Because notice what the centralized grid does that free atmospheric power never could. It creates a permanent customer. Once your light comes from a wire owned by a company, you are paying that company every single month for the rest of your life. You will never own your own light again. You will only ever rent it. And notice who lost in this transition, because they fought it bitterly. The gaslighting companies, which had spent decades laying pipe and building works under the streets of every major city, did not simply hand the night over to electricity. They slashed prices, lobbied councils, and warned anyone who would listen that the new electric wires were dangerous, unproven, and a threat to public safety. They were not entirely wrong about the danger. Early electrical systems did kill people. But they lost anyway, and they lost for a reason that has nothing to do with which light was better. Electricity could do something gas never could. It could be measured with absolute precision, sold by the unit, and scaled into an empire. The gasmen were not defeated by a superior flame. They were defeated by a superior business model, and the same fate, the theory argues, is exactly what was waiting for anything that dared to be free. This is the part of the story that does not actually require any conspiracy at all. It only requires incentives. The men who financed the new electrical grid, the Morgans, the Edisons, the great utility monopolies that formed in this exact window, did not need a secret meeting to agree to bury free energy. They simply needed to invest in the version that printed money, and to let the version that did not quietly die from lack of funding. Tesla learned that lesson at Wardenclyffe the hard way. The market does not reward what is best for people. It rewards what can be built. And the consolidation that followed is not theory. It is the documented economic history of the era, and it is arguably stranger than any conspiracy. Consider a man named Samuel Insull, once Edison's personal secretary, who went on to build one of the largest electrical empires the country had ever seen. Insull understood something most of his rivals did not. The real money was not in selling electricity. It was in controlling the structure that sold it. He pioneered the practice of stitching dozens of small local power companies into vast interlocking holding companies, pyramids of ownership stacked on top of one another, until a single man at the top controlled the light of millions of homes across many states. By the 1920s, a handful of these holding company empires controlled the overwhelming majority of America's electrical power. The distributed, local, place-owned world the atmospheric theory imagines, whether it ever truly existed or not, had become its exact opposite. Energy was now among the most centralized, most concentrated, most fiercely guarded commodities on Earth. And when Insull's empire finally collapsed in the financial crash of the early 1930s, it wiped out the savings of hundreds of thousands of ordinary investors and helped trigger a wave of federal regulation. The lesson the believers draw from this is blunt. The fight over who owns your light was real. It was enormous. And the people who tell you it was always just a simple story about progress are leaving out the part where fortunes the size of nations were built on the act of metering something that used to be free. And once the metered grid existed, the old world had to be made to look obsolete. The pre-electric, or in the theory's words, pre-suppression, buildings were reframed as quaint relics of a darker time. The story was rewritten so that everything before the central power station was primitive and everything after was modern. Whether or not any free energy ever existed, this much is simply true. The people who sold you the new system also got to write the story of why you needed it. So how does a whole technology, a whole way of life, supposedly vanish in 20 years? This is the weakest and the boldest part of the theory, and it deserves a fair hearing. The believers point first to the fires. The late 1800s were, by the historical record, a staggering era of urban destruction. Chicago burned in 1871, Boston burned in 1872. Seattle, Baltimore, San Francisco, and dozens of other cities suffered massive fires that leveled entire downtown districts in a matter of hours. The official cause is usually mundane. A knocked-over lantern, a faulty stove, an earthquake, dry wood, and bad luck. But the theory asks you to notice what happened after each fire. The old, ornate, supposedly free-running districts came down, and what went up in their place was the new world, standardized, wired to a central plant, connected to a meter. To a believer, the fires were not all accidents. They were the demolition phase of a replacement. The old system did not need to be argued away in public. It only needed to burn and then be rebuilt according to the new rules, with the new owners holding the new bills. Picture the pattern the way the theory tells it. A prosperous downtown, full of ornate iron and copper structures that no one alive can quite explain or afford to reproduce. A catastrophic fire that conveniently spares the financial district and the new infrastructure while consuming the old. A rapid rebuild, financed by outside capital, that goes up in a different style entirely, plainer, cheaper, and crucially, wired from end to end to a single central station owned by the same men who financed the rebuild. Repeat that cycle across enough cities in a short enough span, and within 30 years the entire country looks modern, looks wired, looks dependent. The believers do not claim every fire was set. They claim the rebuilds that followed were never neutral, and that disaster has always been the fastest way to replace one system with another, while everyone is too busy grieving to ask who is paying for the new wires. They point too to the destruction of the world's fairs. Those luminous white cities, built and then almost immediately demolished or burned, fit the same pattern. Show the public one last glimpse of the old radiant world. Call it a temporary exhibition. Then tear it down before anyone can ask why it was so much more advanced than the city around it. And finally, they point to the records themselves. The theory holds that the most effective erasure was not physical at all. It was paper. Rewrite the textbooks. Credit the new inventors. Date the birth of electricity to 1882 and not a day earlier. Within 2 generations, anyone who remembered the old way was dead, and the only history that remained was the one the winners had printed. By 1900, the believers say, the job was essentially complete. A new century began, and it began with a clean, official story in which free energy had simply never existed at all. That is the theory, told as completely and as fairly as it can be told. And now we owe it the one thing every theory deserves and almost never gets: an honest cross-examination. Because there is another side to all of this, and intellectual honesty means looking straight at it. Start with the world's fairs. The reason those gleaming buildings were plaster and not stone is not mysterious. It is documented in the planning records. They were always meant to be temporary, because building permanent marble palaces for a single summer would have been financially insane even for that era. They looked like the future because they were designed by the finest architects alive, specifically to look that way on a budget for a show. The fact that they were torn down is not evidence of a cover-up. It is evidence of a tight construction budget. Look at the lights of that 1893 fair too. They were indeed real, and they were indeed spectacular. But they were powered by a very well-documented system, built by Westinghouse using Tesla's alternating current, generated by very ordinary machinery. The fair was not a glimpse of a hidden free energy past. It was, in the boring official version, an advertisement for the brand new electrical industry that was just then being born, which is far less romantic but fits every shred of paper we have. The architecture argument has a quieter problem as well. We tend to look at the few grand buildings that survived and forget the thousands of ordinary, ugly, cramped, poorly built structures from the same era that fell down or were demolished without anyone mourning them. We see the cathedrals and the courthouses and conclude that the past built like gods. We do not see the slums and the shacks that surrounded them because no one bothered to preserve those. It is a trick of memory called survivorship bias, and it makes every past era look more magnificent than it was. And the central claim, the free atmospheric power itself, runs into hard physics. The energy in the atmosphere is real, but it is diffuse. It is spread thin across enormous distances. Capturing a useful, steady, building-powering amount of it, safely, without a storm killing everyone inside, is a problem no one has solved to this day, with materials and computers Tesla could only have dreamed of. The reason the metered grid won is not necessarily that it was more profitable. It may simply be that it was the only one that actually worked at scale. So which is it? A suppressed golden age, switched off by men with meters, or a beautiful misreading of old buildings and old budgets by people who want the past to have been more magical than it was? Here is the honest answer. The specific version, the glowing free energy cities erased by 1900, does not hold up against the documents we have. There is no record of a working ambient power grid, and there is a very thorough record of the messy, smoky, gradual, real transition from gas to coal-fired electricity. But notice what the theory gets right, even when it gets the facts wrong. It is right that the people who controlled energy in this era became some of the richest and most powerful human beings who have ever lived. It is right that the metered grid turned light from something you owned into something you rent forever. It is right that Tesla genuinely dreamed of free wireless power, and that the money behind him genuinely walked away the moment that dream stopped being profitable. And it is right about the deepest thing of all, that whoever controls the supply of energy controls the shape of the entire world, and has every reason in the world to keep it that way. Maybe that is why this theory refuses to die, no matter how many times the facts are laid against it. Because underneath the star forts and the antenna towers and the burning white cities, it is asking a question that has never stopped being true. Not, did they hide free energy from us? But why does the most abundant thing in the universe still arrive at our homes with a bill attached? The pre-1880 cities did not run on free atmospheric electricity. The evidence for that is thin, and the evidence against it is heavy. But the world that replaced them was, in fact, engineered. Engineered by men who understood something the rest of us are only now starting to feel. That the real fortune was never in the light itself. It was in owning the switch. So the next time you find yourself standing in front of one of those old buildings, the courthouse with the tower that serves no purpose, the station with the impossible dome, look up at it for a second longer than you normally would. You are almost certainly looking at nothing more than the ambition and craft of people who lived and died long before you. But you are also looking at the last architecture humanity built before the meter arrived. And whatever you choose to believe about how the lights inside it once worked, one quiet fact remains, sitting there in plain sight, asking to be noticed. We do not build like that anymore. And somebody somewhere decided that we never would again. So hold both of these ideas in your head at the same time, because the truth probably lives in the space between them. The free energy city is almost certainly a myth, a beautiful story stitched together from old buildings, old fires, and a deep, justified suspicion of the men who got rich, keeping us in the dark. There was no secret grid humming through the spires of 1876. The smoke and the coal and the slow grind of the real transition are all there in the record, for anyone willing to look. And yet the instinct underneath the myth is sound. Energy was captured. Ownership was concentrated. A thing that nature gives away for nothing was wrapped in wires and pipes and patents and turned into a bill that has never once stopped arriving. The atmospheric theory gets the mechanism wrong and the motive right. It points at the wrong century and the wrong technology, but it points, unmistakably, at something true. That the question of who owns your light was one of the great quiet wars of the modern age, and that most of us never even knew it was being fought. The lights are still on tonight. Somewhere, a meter is still turning. And the only thing left to ask, as you look up at those impossible old towers one more time, is the question this whole story was really about from the very beginning. Not how did they do it, but why does the most abundant force in the universe still come to your door with a price?